Alright, today we're going to be going over intensity again, but we're going to be classifying the intensity, and you're going to start seeing some of the overlap in programming and where volume and intensity can start mingling, having a bit of interchange, interplay, and how that's going to help you kind of form your programming basis or help you to form the overload. Basically, within programming, there needs to be a vehicle for overload. And that can be delivered through frequency, volume, intensity, variation, duration in fitness training, but with duration in strength training is probably a lot less relevant. So utilizing the key training principles, we produce overload, or we produce a vehicle for overload. So that can be done purely through volume in what would be known as the accumulation cycle. It can be done in intensity, which will end in a peak in what is known as an intensification cycle, or some kind of interplay between the variables. A good program will utilize a mixture of different variables to produce overload, to produce outcome, and it will vary what it uses over time, and it will also vary based on the goal and where you are based in the training cycle. If you're coming up close to a meet, for example, you're probably looking more of an accumulation. If you're peaking, some kind of accumulation phase into a peaking phase, into a taper, and at the end you're going to do the meet, and hopefully you'll realize some new personal bests, or you'll realize some progress. Or in a more general phase, we're probably looking more at some kind of cyclical loading pattern with the idea of producing a hypertrophy output. So we're producing a hypertrophy gain, or we're producing some kind of skill acquisition gain. There's some general brick, or there's something fundamental within the program that we're going to look to produce utilizing less kind of intensity and probably more variation, more frequency, and more volume based. So you'll see on my screen I have a pyramid or a hierarchy. So basically the way it's set out is the bottom end is the very low end stuff, so that's basically 0 as in body weight movements, right up to around 60%. So some of these splits or some of these categories are more based on what's practical from a programming sense, and you'll see there is a definite overlap between the two. It's more to get you in the way of thinking of what the goal of this kind of training is, what this kind of training zone is, what the outcome is, what am I trying to produce from this outcome. So you see we have 3 zones. We have 0 to 60%, which is more of a hypertrophy, kind of core endurance, assistance kind of zone. So this is where we're looking to produce more systemic change. So when I say systemic, I mean more body-wise. So for an example of which would be within core endurance. So maybe we're looking to increase your postural endurance, your ability to produce movements, or what are known as engrams, so that you can associate hip movement and arm movement away from trunk movement. So you start thinking about using your trunk or your core to anchor, to be stiff and to hold shape under load. So that's an example of something that's quite general, and probably you'd see more as a rehab or a prehab exercise or activity, but it has utility within strength training, or it has utility within powerlifting, and that's very low intensity. That's body weight or less than body weight, so that's around 0%. But producing that movement, producing that change, produces real outcome, produces real effect at top level. Because at the top of the pyramid, you're going to find out what's wrong at the bottom. So if we have skill deficiencies, if we have basic movement deficiencies, if we have basic endurance deficiencies, then we're going to realize that higher up the pyramid. When we perform a max or a rep max, we're going to see knees buckling, we're going to see trunks collapsing, we're going to see a twist develop into the technique. So we're going to see things happening at the top end that we pretty much need to address down at the bottom end. So we're just going to start at the bottom, so 0 to 60%. So this is more of your hypertrophy, general conditioning or general preparation zone, if you will. So it's split up into 4 categories. We have postural endurance, which is basically all trunk work, so it can be anterior or posterior, so lower back extensions, lower like holds out of a hyper, as well as anterior core or more kind of planks, side planks. So you need to think of the trunk as a whole. So I like to think of it more postural because that's effectively what we're trying to affect with these interventions. Then you have GPP work, so any kind of single leg work we have, general back work, so if we're a power lifter, things like shoulder presses, things like rows, things like pull-ups, to a lesser extent grip work, that all falls under general physical preparation. So what we're looking to do there, we're either looking to produce, in the case of grip, we're probably looking more to induce strength and endurance in that particular physical quality. Something like a back or a shoulder press, like a row or a shoulder press, strength's less the goal. Increasing your shoulder press is probably not going to have utility, it's probably not going to have carryover into your bench press because they're two completely different planes of movement, and strength is incredibly specific. So the further away from the plane of movement, so the plane of movement of bench press being on the horizontal line down, the further we move away from that plane, the less utility we're going to get out of that exercise. So we can't move any further away from that plane than vertical, which is what we do in shoulder press. But it's important to have, for one, we can utilize shoulder press to produce more stability of the shoulder joint in a different plane of movement, which is going to make it more robust. We can produce hypertrophy of the anterior deltoid, which is one of the movers in bench press, which gives us utility. That hypertrophy, non-specific hypertrophy, is cross-sectional area, or it is muscle mass that we can utilize in our sport-specific training to produce a strength gain. So the more muscle mass we have, the more cross-sectional area, the greater strength potential we have. So there's utility there. So, but it's just general physical preparation, or just generally being a healthy athlete. So doing things like clamshells, core work, although core is probably a bit more important, so it has its own part of the pyramid, because it is a very important piece of the puzzle. General physical preparations, just basically non-lift specific stuff that we want to do in a program to have a balanced physique, balanced muscle mass, and just give ourselves the best opportunity to be able to withstand a hard or robust training regime without breaking down in injury. Then to the right here we have more sport-specific outcomes. So we have hypertrophy, which is specific to a movement. So for instance, doing 10s on a back squat at 50% say, that's an example of some lower level intensity that has a specific outcome. That's going to produce specific hypertrophy. It's going to have very little lag time on it. So if we do lots of volume that we can recover from and put on cross-sectional area or muscle mass, utilizing the same motor pattern that we're trying to strengthen, we're going to have very little lag time with that. It's not going to take us long to convert size that we've gained doing squat into a stronger squat. Whereas we utilize non-specific hypertrophy, such as we stay with the lower body theme, leg press and leg extensions for squat, there is lag time on that, because the muscles that we hypertrophy, the cross section or the line of fiber, the motor units that we innervate when we perform those movements are not going to be the same as squat. So the line of pull in the quadricep on a squat is going to be different than the line of pull during a leg press. So whatever hypertrophy we get from leg press is going to be trickled down. We're going to get some benefit, but we're not going to get the same benefit as we would if we performed squat for the hypertrophy that we're looking for. So you see we also put in the potential for volume load. The potential for volume load here is incredibly high. For some of the interventions such as the core work, we can do that daily, we can do it multiple times per day, and we won't have a deleterious or a negative effect. We'll have a positive effect. The frequency, the durations and the volumes that we can utilize in this zone are much greater than when we go further up the curve. So we look at the next one. So this is basically where most of the strength gain is going to happen. This is 50 to 85% of max. This is basically where the vast chunk, or the vast majority of your training is going to happen for powerlifting or for strength training itself. If you're an athlete, you probably don't need to go any higher than this 50 to 85%, because as we'll discuss, anything higher than this is more around optimization. So what we're going to get skill specific execution. So when we perform squats, deadlifts, bench presses, push presses in this zone, in this 50 to 85% zone, and probably more towards the 75 to 85% zone, we're getting a really good simulation of the timing, the loading, the bracing, everything that's involved in producing a good execution of that movement. We're getting a good execution of that movement at higher percentages or at maximal percentages. We're getting a much better simulation of what that's going to be like, and we can perform a much greater volume of this. So once we get in here, the vehicle for adaptation or the vehicle for improvement becomes a mixture of both cross-sectional area, hypertrophy increases bone mineral density, morphological changes, this changes to muscle, bone, tendon structures, and also we start looking at more of a neurological change as well, better skill acquisition, rate coding, intermuscular coordination, basically we're basically get better at the skill, but we're also producing morphological outputs because of the volume, which is probably the most important factor when it comes to morphological change or hypertrophy. Specifically, we can still have a large enough volume effort or volume load to still have that change, to still have that outcome from this training. So within this kind of zone, this is more of our, this is going to probably make up the vast majority of our training. In season training or specific to powerlifting, this is probably going to be the majority of your training. You'll probably do less of the GPP stuff or within the 0 to 60% zone. This is also a zone where we can accrue volume. This is a zone where we can produce volume overload. We can accumulate fatigue in this zone and have skill specific outputs. We can have an overreach and we can have a bump in your performance in this zone. So programs like Russian squat routine, which is accumulation, then a realization program, this is the zone which they live in, and that's at 80%. That's where majority of that program happens. When you get into the peaking phase of the program, you're going to move into the next zone of intensity. So finally, we have the top of the pyramid, which is the maximum capacity. So basically when we get into this zone, what we're doing is we're just learning how to lift heavy weights. We can't actually produce enough volume of effort to produce a lot of morphological change, that is to induce much hypertrophy. We will induce things such as bone mineral density increases, tendon loading will happen in this zone, but we just simply can't produce enough volume, or we can't do enough work in this zone without overtraining to produce hypertrophy really. So this is more of a peaking zone. This is where we're going to go and get better at the sport. So if you want to become a better power lifter, bearing in mind with what you got, so the example is if your personal best is 160 kilos in the squat, but you've had a really good 4 or 5 training cycles and you reckon your capacity is around 200, 210, then how you're going to realize that capacity and turn it into an actual performance is getting more into this 85 to 100% zone. So this is almost purely skill-based change. So we get used to unracking a heavy weight, we get used to settling a heavy weight, we get used to the changes of the characteristic of the barbell, it becomes more whippy, it's got a different feel to it, bracing becomes a lot more important, it becomes a lot more important to control things like the eccentric. Basically all of the skill acquisition that goes around lifting near maximal to maximal weights. That neurological change, that skill acquisition, is what's going to happen in this zone. And this is something you can dip in and out of on a regular basis. If you do something like RPE based training, you maybe do something in this zone maybe once, twice a week. This is something you can do in a peaking cycle. This is something you can do a more volume in if you perform some kind of volume accumulation, so your fitness is much higher, so you can start doing 5s at 85%, 4s at 90%, so on and so forward through the volume through the volume accumulation, you've increased your potential, your capacity to a point where it can actually produce a reasonable amount of volume in the zone. But we can only produce that volume in the zone for a finite period of time, 5 weeks, 6 weeks maybe, before we start overreaching, we start overtraining, and we start peaking out basically. So this is something you can dip in and out of on a regular basis if you're in some kind of specific training cycle leading towards a meet, or trying to improve your powerlifting performance outside of a meet. It's also something we can utilize to make the most of what we've got. But it's not going to be the main vehicle of overload, it's not going to be the main vehicle of progression. All of that happens down in the other two strata, in the other two parts of the pyramid. We need to, if we want to increase our potential, we need to widen the base of the pyramid before we go up. So we need to produce better general physical preparation, we need to increase our cross-sectional area, we need to increase our energy system efficiencies, we need to be able to better recover from sets and reps. We basically need to become better generally prepared before we can increase the top end of the pyramid, before we can actually realize better performance. To transmute or to change that general physical preparation, we need to do more work in the middle ground, so we can still produce some of those morphological changes, increase cross-sectional area, increase hypertrophy, increase efficiency, but working more on the nuance, more of the skill-based execution, work at speeds that are more realistic, work on bracing that's more realistic, and basically just take that general work that we've produced and become a more efficient lifter. And then finally, if we want to show what we've got, you got to get into that top end, you need to get into that 85 and realistically more in the 90 to 100% range. So hopefully that's helped you think more around intensities and what they actually mean in the context of a program. The next topic we're going to cover will be frequency. Thank you very much for watching. My name is Marquise. If you have any questions or comments, leave them below. Like if you're on Facebook, if you're on YouTube, smash that subscribe button. Peace out. Check you later.